Kick it off.
Yeah, well, I'm just going to introduce you. This is Jonah from the, he's from Bennington. He's the communications coordinator. He's going to talk about the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the Northshire's role in the formation of Vermont. And if anybody is watching on the live stream, I'm sorry it's crooked. We had technical difficulties. Jonah. Thank you. And afterwards, of course, there are the refreshments after.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for inviting me to speak with you today. I really appreciate it. As she said, my name is Jonah Spivak, and I do wear a lot of hats, including this funny one that I'm wearing today, classic 18th century tricorn hat. But I also serve on Vermont's 250th Anniversary Commission, and that was formed in 2020. And in addition to that, I serve on a regional committee of the various states in New England and, of course, New York, of 250th planners. So we can all kind of collaborate on this upcoming anniversary, because our story is very much a regional story. But it's also a multi-state story, right? So you can't really do a good job interpreting it and sharing that story without working with our partners throughout the various states. So I'm involved in that. There's also an America 250 effort, which you may or may not have heard of. They got some buzz recently because they redid their logo. In fact, the same company that did the I Love New York logo did the new America 250 logo. So I also collaborate with that effort. And as she said, my day job is working for the town of Bennington. I'm their communications coordinator. But full disclosure, I grew up in Shaftesbury. And honestly, I'm very grateful to the town of Bennington, and mention this to my town manager if you see him, that they actually put some skin in the game with this 250th by allowing me to spend so much time and effort on this 250th endeavor. The fact is, our region played a major role in the story of the founding of Vermont and our nation during that 1775 to 1777 time period. Today we're going to talk about that role, as well as past commemorations and plans for the upcoming anniversary years. So, maybe you've heard the 250th anniversaries are coming. The 250th, also known as the semi-quincentennial, or the bicentenary, say that 3 times fast. Some have suggested calling it the semi-quin for short, but I find myself just saying the 250th. Not to be confused with Act 250, because nobody likes hearing about that. I first began thinking about anniversaries as part of my research into the Battle of Bennington and local history. And what started as an exercise learning about the interesting details of the battle kept crossing over into ways that the battle was being remembered and celebrated over time. The battle has actually been celebrated annually, continuously, since the year after it was fought. So 1778 was the first anniversary and first commemoration of the Battle of Bennington. And this is so exciting, because I was like, this is amazing. This is the only continuously celebrated battle of the American Revolution. But no, I was corrected, sort of, at the 2019 Congress of Revolutionary Roundtables in Philadelphia, where the representative from North Carolina pointed out that the Battle of Cowpens also has been continuously celebrated.
Cowpens?
Cowpens.
Cowpens.
Cowpens, yeah. To which I replied, that may be so, but that wasn't until 1781, so the Battle of Bennington is still the oldest continuously. There you go, exactly. So it seems we are compelled to remember our past. In addition to those annual celebrations, we have had some really big ones. In 1877, in 1891, 1927, 1976, and 1991, to name a few. More about those later. But all those celebrations and this history of celebrations really got me wondering, what great things can we all do for the 250th? Sharing this history, sharing our stories can unify us. At a time when civic engagement and civil discourse is in real jeopardy, We need the lessons that history can teach us, more than ever. James Baldwin was quoted in an exhibit at the Bennington Museum. He writes, "History does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all that we do." Did you know that 30% of historic-related organizations in the United States were established around the bicentennial in 1976? Amazing. We would like to see a similar increase in participation for the 250th. Engaging historical societies, community organizations, and civic groups is essential. And to further this work, we've created the Bennington 250th Committee. We've outlined a scope and purpose for this committee. And number one, it's regional. Just like we talked about how the various states all played a role in our story, all the towns within the shires, the North Shire and the South Shire, played an important interwoven role in this story. That's why it's so crucial that this effort be truly regional in nature. We'd like to support, plan, and fund events. We want to inspire that next generation of stewards of our history, right? Because where are they? Where are the young people? We need to get them engaged. And of course, we do want to honor the Battle of Bennington and that history. And we also want to think about honoring Seth Warner's regiment, the Green Mountain Boys, and Sip Ives, who you may or may not know of, but we'll mention again a little bit later in this presentation. Perhaps this can be an umbrella for related events and organizations. We'd like to encourage visitation to historic sites and historic societies. We'd like to engage in community building. And last but not least, we want to promote pride in our community and that civic engagement point that we talked about earlier. So let's start by talking, what are those anniversary years? I was introduced, we're going to talk about 2026, but we're going to talk about more of that. Our anniversary years are going to start in 2025 because, like most states in New England, our story doesn't begin in 2026. That's the federal 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. No, we want to back it up a little bit. We're going to start in 2025. That's the story of the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen capturing Fort Ticonderoga. That's huge. We don't want to not include that. Yeah, we'll take advantage of 2026. That federal event, the Declaration of Independence, everyone on board, absolutely. Let's hope it's going to be as big as and exciting as the bicentennial was. And let's use that excitement to propel us to Vermont's signature anniversary year in 2027. And that, of course, is the founding of the Republic of Vermont and the battles of Hubbardton and Bennington. So I'm going to go over a little more of that history of commemorations. Bennington Battle Day, this is a Vermont state holiday, and now that I'm a municipal worker, which is actually a new thing for me, I get the day off. Woohoo! I'm pretty excited. In fact, there's only one other state that has a holiday for a battle. That's Texas, San Jacinto Day, which was the culminating battle in their War of Independence against Mexico. Although I do note that it's a partial staffing holiday, which means that state workers don't get the day off in Texas.
Oh.
I know, right? Anticlimactic.
Are the banks closed on August 16th?
Well, the banks are not closed, so it's a state holiday, so all state employees, and as a worker for the town, I count as a state employee.
We're the only people.
So we're the only ones, I'm afraid, but I'm enjoying it.
I'm sure.
So some of those huge celebrations, 1877, we had President Rutherford B. Hayes at our commemoration, and think about that date. Just a few years after the Civil War, this incredible crisis where the nation was torn apart. I think that year more than any other, they wanted to make a connection back to a time when we were all much more unified. And talking about the Revolutionary War was a great way to do that. And let's also remember that R.B. Hayes, as he was known at the time, served with the Vermont Regiment at the Battle of Cedar Creek in the Civil War. So he knew Vermonters, and he knew their mettle. And I think that also inspired him to come to that first big celebration. Oh, they also conceived the idea, maybe we should build a monument. And then don't you know, in 1891, there's the dedication of the battle monument. And another sitting president, Benjamin Harrison, coming to join us for that event. I put 1927 on there because it's striking just in the number of people that came. 100,000 people came to the Shires of Vermont to celebrate with us that 150th anniversary of the Battle of Bennington. Also a huge...
I'm really sorry to interrupt. Who's got a silver Toyota that's parked behind Sterling?
Park behind Sterling?
Yeah.
That's me.
Oh, can I show you? I'm so sorry.
It was also a celebration with an extraordinary number of monuments that were placed as part of the commemorations. We also had big celebrations, 1976, and I would even say the 1991 bicentennial of statehood was also a pretty big event. In 1809, the fathers of Bennington wrote to General Stark in New Hampshire. And they said, many of our young people no longer remember the face of the man who led us to glorious victory at the Battle of Bennington. Would you please consider coming to Bennington for our this year's annual celebration? And unfortunately, Stark at that time was in his 80s. He was not in the best of health. He instead wrote a letter, part of which is on the screen here, to the people of our portion of Vermont, saying that sadly he would not be able to attend, but he shared some thoughts on democracy and liberty, and he ended with a toast to the veterans of the Battle of Bennington. He said, "Live free or die." And you may remember that or recall that that is now the slogan for New Hampshire. It's on all their license plates. Fun fact, that's not the whole quote. It's "live free or die, some things are worse than death." But I guess you can't fit all that on a license plate, so I stuck with that first one. Words matter. Anniversary versus celebration. Rather than thinking of America 250 years ago as an origin story, I think it would be useful for us to consider it an inflection point. An inflection point in the story of a nation struggling to become the nation we hope to be and are still becoming. Keep in mind, for Native Americans, for other peoples, this was not something to celebrate necessarily. On the next few slides, I'm going to share some thoughts from other people looking forward to the 250th. We'll start with this one. We propose that Vermont 250 move from celebrating the past to looking for all that today's Vermonters have in common. Let's make Vermont 250 about common ground and common interests and common love of Vermont. This from Lyman Orton of the Vermont Country Store. A theme for the state's 250th anniversary would take a new look at the Vermont Independent Republic of 1777 and how it emerged successfully out of a political and economic swirl of adversaries in all directions. Vermont's was the first democratically organized independent republic on the North American continent, a full decade before the U.S. Constitution was formulated. That from Tyler Resch, a local historian. And I love that. A political and economic swirl of adversaries. Such great use of language. So he's an author and historian. And then this, history, good or bad, is something we can learn from to make a better future. That from Dan Lyle, Post 13 Legion Riders, on the occasion of the rededication of the Civil War monument at the Bennington Museum. I just love that pithy expression. So, what are we celebrating? There's really two parallel courses here. One is really the story of the founding of the nation. And this is the military side. This is the capture of Fort Ticonderoga. It's the Declaration of Independence. It's the Battle of Hubbardton, the Battle of Bennington. But on a parallel track, it's the story of the founding of Vermont. It's the Westminster Massacre. It's the Dorset Convention and Declaration, which actually crossed over into 1776. And the Vermont Declaration of Independence in 1777, and then culminating in the signing of the Vermont Constitution, just a few days after the Battle of Hubbardton, in the midst of a furious war in the crucible of the American Revolution. Our shared stories. We have amazing stories to tell. Our state, as I said, was born in the crucible of the Revolutionary War, and we played a major role. Our story is much more diverse than commonly known and can unite us. We can use these anniversaries to shine a spotlight on these stories and increase civic awareness. And my photo here of Sean Harrington, curator for the Manchester Historical Society, and John Mathewson of our very own Dorset Historical Society, shamelessly photoshopped onto this image of the Ethan Allen Monument in Manchester.
Oh.
Thanks to effort by Sean and John, history is kept alive locally. We can also use these anniversaries to revitalize interest in our history and inspire that next generation of youth. The historic marker next to this monument, by the way, is all about Ethan Allen and the capture of Fort Ticonderoga in 1775. And remember, that's our 250th kickoff year. These were unsettled times, and loyalties were not clear. Let's talk about the stories of two local Green Mountain boys. And Manchester Historical Society curator Sean Harrington wrote, and I quote, "For example, William Marsh was a town father, a colonel of the militia, and in the Vermont Council of Safety would meet in his tavern. His primary concern was for the stability of the new Vermont Republic. The perceived threat from the Yorkers, perhaps greater than that of Burgoyne, which had played a role in the Continental Congress's refusal to grant Vermont statehood, likely fueled his decision to turn loyalist between the battles of Hubbardton and Bennington in June and August, respectively." End quote. Marsh does eventually return from his Canadian exile after the war, settling just over the Manchester town line in East Dorset, because he was actually not allowed to return to Manchester. His 1818 gravestone in the cemetery there has two badges: SAR, Sons of the American Revolution, and UE Loyalist, United Empire Loyalist. A unique recognition for a unique man. Did you know that Thomas Rowley, one of the first settlers of Danby, and who served as Danby's first town clerk, was called the Bard of the Green Mountain Boys? Known for his poem, "To Rutland Go," Rowley helped to popularize settlement of what would become Vermont through his literary skill. Just as the recent Broadway play, Hamilton, by Lin-Manuel Miranda, has rejuvenated interest in Alexander Hamilton, we need new creative ideas to bring the history to life again for the 250th. And there is that poem, "To Rutland Go." So let's talk a little about this first anniversary year in 2025. For Dorset and the North Shire, 1775 was an important year. That will be the 250th anniversary of the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, memorialized in that Manchester monument, and the Dorset Convention right here in Dorset that occurred on July 27th of that year. And here I quote Dorset Historical Society curator John Mathewson. I hope you're watching. He writes regarding the Dorset Convention, quote, "This signals when the separate towns of the New Hampshire grants began to unify as a political unit separate from New Hampshire, New York, and the Continental Congress. After 3 more meetings in Dorset in 76, they were ready to declare themselves their own nation at a meeting in Westminster in January of 1777. The new nation was named New Connecticut for 5 months, until the Constitution was written and the Republic adopted the name of Vermont instead." End quote. Thank you, John. So a kickoff even prior to that is actually this very year in 2024. One of the things we want to do to build awareness in this final year before the start of the anniversaries is to both let people know about it and also do a little fundraising. So we want to beef up the Bennington Battle Day events, which is already kind of a deal, but with a much more of a regional flair. And we thought doing a Liberty pole raising would be a good way to do that. Liberty poles, if you don't know, were basically like the mast or a tree that they would raise up on the town square to And then they would hammer on proclamations of the things they were mad about. You know, no taxation without representation, down with the Stamp Act. And then, of course, the British would come and promptly cut it down, and then they would re-erect it. And that's what we were doing in 1774, 250 years ago. And then, of course, after that, we just started shooting. And then we weren't worried about Liberty Poles anymore. We also want to raise some money for these events that we want to do to support the activities and the things that will be happening in 25 through 2027. So one idea is to have a fundraising gala as part of that weekend with period dishes served and historical interpreters. We're going to have Ethan Allen at the event, as well as other local figures like Colonel Marsh and other folks like that. So those are some things we could jump on this year, and we would like to get every historical society to have a float in the Bennington Battle Day Parade that thousands upon thousands of people come to. And I don't remember if it was John or Sean that mentioned this idea, but he told us about a float done by an historical society in another parade, where on the float there was a coffin lying there, and on the side of the coffin it said, "Bringing history alive." And every few minutes, a body would rise up from the coffin, wave at the crowd, and then go back down. So I think that's a wonderful idea. I think the Dorset Historical Society should jump on that one. And of course, one of our most important shared stories is the Battle of Bennington. Did you know that when Burgoyne first set out to invade and attack Vermont, the object of his attack was Manchester? That's right, it was. Only after the expedition had set out, based on new information from a loyalist, Justice Sherwood of Arlington, he changed his attack from Manchester to Bennington, where he learned that there was a large store of horses, cattle, and other supplies they needed, and that it was only weakly defended. Of course, much to his chagrin, that weakly defended aspect did not continue, because John Stark heard the call of Ira Allen, who said, "We are now your frontier." And New Hampshire rallied, and of course sent a brigade of 1,800 people. Not all of them made it to Bennington. They were in various places, but roughly 1,400 were in Bennington at the time of the battle, so no longer weakly defended, now strongly held with one of the heroes of the Revolution in command. You know, on the screen I have a number of interesting facts about the Battle of Bennington, and that's just some of them. I could literally go for hours talking about why the Battle of Bennington is so cool. Remember, this is what got me into this whole thing in the first place. Learning about commemorations was the Battle of Bennington. But I'm not going to go into detail there. Invite me back if you'd like to hear more, or invite Don back. He's another expert. I do want to point out a couple of tidbits. And this one is from Don Miller, who's sitting in the audience here. More men were killed and captured at the Battle of Bennington than both battles of Saratoga combined. I think that's an important point to consider and remember when we think about the turning point of the American Revolution, which is what Saratoga is often called, the fact that Bennington played a major role in making that happen. Why? Because it was the first successful storming of an emplaced artillery position by a militia army. This was hugely important. It heartened the rebels incredibly. So, because of this massive victory at Bennington, when Gates at Saratoga called the militia, they came in their thousands upon thousands, giving him a huge numerical superiority against Burgoyne, which was really the key to his success. So, the Battle of Bennington, of course, is in nearby New York. But I would clarify that, because if you see this red line here, that is the core battle area. The black area is the area of operations, and I added in this New York-Vermont border to put to rest this idea that the battle was only in New York. Part of it did happen in Vermont. And in fact, for a glorious 2 years during the Greater Vermont period, this is a map of Vermont in 1780, and that arrow is pointing to the location of the Battle of Bennington. And this is a time when Vermont had annexed eastern New York right up to the Hudson River. Literally, towns of Granville, Cambridge, Hoosick Falls, they voted to join Vermont. So at that time, there was obviously no question the battlefield was in Vermont, although this modified version shows a more of a current configuration, and we were nice. We did end up giving that bit back to New York, and the Battle of Bennington site is now, of course, just over the border mostly.
When did we give back that portion to New York?
1781. So it was a 2-year period that it was part of Vermont. And fun fact, the western half of New Hampshire also got annexed by Vermont for a year or so. That was not as nice, considering how generous they were supplying troops to us at Bennington. But yeah, the Greater Vermont period, a very unusual point in our history. So these are the eyes of a person looking at the final approved design of the future Bennington Battle Monument. And if I had a drum roll, this would be the time to do it. Here it is, the final design for the Battle Monument. Dun, dun, dun!
Wow.
This
By the artist?
is the original approved design of the Bennington Battle Monument. And those eyes we saw earlier, those are the eyes of Highland Hall. Father-in-law of Trenor Park, who built the Park McCullough House, governor of Vermont, a historian, an author in his own right. He took one look at that design and said, no way. No way is that lame grouping of statues gonna be enough to commemorate this amazing story that we have here. And in fact, he in his 80s went around to every member of that committee and changed their mind. And instead, of course, today, we have what he said we needed, something monumental and lofty. And that is our current Bennington Battle Monument. To this day, the tallest man-made structure in Vermont. One message Highland Hall is sharing with us is that we don't have to settle, and it's okay to dare to think big. So that's kind of why we're here today, right? And what big things can we do? And I have some past photos of celebrations to share, but before I do, just a couple of fun images of the building of the Battle Monument. Again, this was in 1889, 1890. I believe it was finished in 89 and then dedicated in 91. The cornerstone laid with full rights by the Masons. And by the way, thanks to Phil Holland for this slide. If you don't know Phil, he's an author and local historian and would be another great person to have come talk to you folks at some point. And in fact, he provided these next several slides. This is a picture of an arch that they built over Main Street for the parade in 1877. It was a rainy day, but the people still came out in their multitudes to enjoy the day, along with, of course, Rutherford B. Hayes. And there are those tenting grounds. Now, when Hayes came, he came with many of his old units from the Civil War, and they marched to Bennington in their units and then camped like they did during the wars in Bennington for that event. So 1891, that's the dedication of the Battle Monument, another huge celebration. This one with Benjamin Harrison, President Benjamin Harrison and most of his cabinet attending the celebrations. And another arch built over Main Street, this of wood and painted canvas, it's not actually stone. And actually through the arch, that is the Putnam Motel, still there in Bennington downtown. And I might add, a starry-eyed Calvin Coolidge at age 19 was in the crowd watching this parade. 1911, electricity finally showed up. So there we have an electrified Main Street as part of the celebrations. A detail of the Drysdale building, all lit up and with its patriotic flair. Creative Works, they did a pageant that year. And here's an image as part of that where they had recreated the Catamount Tavern. And there they are raising the Catamount on top. Pointedly aimed west towards New York with its snarling visage. They had a tea party and danced the minuet. Now we're going to jump forward to 1927. That's that really huge one. 100,000 people came to this. And there's a photograph now of that parade. More recently, bicentennial, right? A lot of us remember that very fondly. I was in 4th grade at the time, and it impacted me hugely. And I dare say is part of the reason why I'm here today, doing this presentation. It was well reported in the banner. There was a whole week-long series of events, but not without some strife. There was some friction and complaints amongst the people about who was going to do what and where things would happen. But a happy postscript to this is after the bicentennial, there was also articles how people were talking that they had talked with neighbors and friends that they had not talked to in years. So despite the controversy and the buildup, it ended up being a pretty unifying thing for most Americans. There's a picture of the encampment that year. And the big gala event for the reenactment, it kind of looks like Woodstock, doesn't it? The crowd there on the left, people hanging out on the fences. And here's another photo of the reenactment. And another photo of the reenactment. With the 76 flag, which we now know, of course, did not fly at the Battle of Bennington, but a nice little historic piece. At that time, we thought it was the case.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Why did they decide to celebrate reenact the Battle of Bennington in 1976 when it actually, the 200th would have been?
It was I misspoke. The reenactment was in 1977. So
Oh, okay.
1976 was a big year, and then the following year, because remember, we commemorate this battle every year, kind of like we're trying to do now. The excitement buildup from the bicentennial then carried over to the following year for this absolutely huge reenactment. Most of those reenactors might have been busy the year before doing 250th or 200th bicentennial stuff in other areas, but because we had all those reenactors, we got them to come out in their hundreds to the reenactment the next year in 1977. So, thank you for that. So there I am clarifying happily that in the parade that year also we had Governor and Mrs. Snelling walk the parade, portraying Mr. and Mrs. Benning Wentworth. So some ideas, and we have lots. And actually, if you go to our website, bennington250.org, you will see pages upon pages of ideas. But I'm going to mention a few of them. One is something around the monument. There's an old road there, you'll see that in a minute. Maybe we could do something with that. Maybe we could rebuild the Catamount Tavern. Maybe we could add a covered bridge. Maybe that battlefield in New York, one striking thing about it is there's a railroad that goes dead through the center of the battlefield. It's on a 12-foot raised pathway. And at first when I saw it, I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. They put a railroad right through the middle of our battlefield, which is weird, right? But what if we use that railway as a unique way to interpret the battle? It follows the route that Stark took to attack the center of the battlefield. It's on a 12-foot rise thing. We could put a passenger train on there for people that like trains, because there's people that like that as well. And what about using that to bring people from Manchester all the way down to the Bennington battlefield, and then back and forth, back and forth. Let's put some interpreters on the train to tell the story as it goes along. So that's another idea. Memorials. And we're going to be looking at a bunch of memorials shortly. What about a memorial for Sip Ives? I mentioned him earlier. Sip Ives was a Green Mountain Boy, and he was a person of color. And he was the one Green Mountain Boy that was killed at the Battle of Bennington. Why don't we know more about that? In fact, there were several black people that were served in the Green Mountain Boys. The same day that Sip Ives enlisted, two brothers, also black, joined on that same day. It's also important that we remember the locals that lost their lives. I mean, 4 locals right from our immediate vicinity also were killed at the battle, and of course several more were injured. Another view of the monument, I want to talk a little bit about its location, because one thing it's not is the location of the battlefield, right? So some places become hallowed because blood was shed there, and that certainly is our Bennington battlefield. Other places become hallowed because we make them so. And the Bennington Battle Monument is kind of like that. Here's another view. This is from the early 1800s. There's the monument again, and what you can see on the right, there's that old North Road coming down from the monument all the way down to what used to be called the old red covered bridge. No longer exists, but that's one thought. Maybe we could recreate that pathway, maybe as a pedestrian pathway from the monument to the river, maybe even rebuild a bridge. So that earlier slide where you saw the monument from above, part of the reason I wanted to show that, because one of the things that was located on that site was the State Arms building, a very nice building, a site of very many anniversary commemorations. Many toasts were drunk to the Battle of Bennington at the State Arms, but they chose to tear it down, along with several other important buildings in the center of their community to make way for a battle monument. I think that says something about a people that are willing to do that, to devote such a key part of their community to remembering this history. Other buildings that are no longer with us, there's the Catamount Tavern, but we know what it looked like. You know, if we're gonna, maybe we could recreate, if not the actual building, maybe a mock-up of the building, so people can learn about the story of the Catamount Tavern, the headquarters of the Green Mountain Boys. We have Ethan Allen's bar bill from the Catamount Tavern. So he lived right next door, so he was a frequent visitor. In fact, a fun side note, I thought one of the ideas for our fundraising could be, let's total up his bar bill and figure out what it would be in today's dollars and let people pay Ethan Allen's bar bill. We'll give them a copy of the bar bill, you know, from that we have, and then and a little button says, I paid Ethan Allen's bar bill.
It's still outstanding?
No, let's just say yes for the purpose of this.
And he'll get the money.
Well, not me. That would be for the 250th
Yeah.
celebrations. This is a painting of the aftermath of the Battle of Bennington, and in the background you can see the meeting house. This was Bennington's original meeting house. It's where the prisoners were kept, or at least the regular rank and file prisoners. The officers were housed in with residents that just lived in Bennington, and were let out on parole, in effect, on their honor. They would be walking around the streets of Bennington. But not so much the common men. They were locked up in the meeting house. This photo is really interesting. You can see, starting on the left by the flag, of course, that's Seth Warner, our local hero, and able commander under Stark, who's brandishing the sword on the horse there. And that kind of brings me to talking a little bit about reenactments, because having people in garb, having the opportunity to learn about life in the 18th century and what people wore and ate and drank and did is really interesting to the public, and this gets people excited. When we started banging the drum about the 250th, we decided we wanted to do a 250th anniversary pretty much every year, and we started in 2021. So that picture on the bottom left, that's from the Breckinridge standoff, which was the first armed confrontation between the New York authorities and the settlers of what would later become Vermont. And some call it the birthplace of Vermont as a result of that. And I also would note that Ira Allen, in his History of Vermont, retroactively calls the people of the Breckinridge standoff Green Mountain Boys, even though that name had not been coined yet. So you could also argue that it was the birthplace of the Green Mountain Boys. And we certainly made both those arguments in that year. Although I would note that there are many places in Vermont that can claim to be the birthplace of Vermont, so we're not unique in that. On the bottom right, that was a reenactment of the capture and rescue of Remember Baker, perhaps one of the Green Mountain Boys' most feared members, who lived in East Arlington. And that was a really fun event. And on a side note, he was also part of the invasion of Canada in 1775 and was perhaps the first casualty of the, is that correct?
Presumably so.
Yeah, and there's a monument about that in East Arlington as well. By the way, we did commission another historic marker for Remember Baker as part of this event, and we're still waiting for it to be delivered. But the state is working on that. So we said, well, what can we do in 2023, the 250th anniversary? And we said, well, you know, really what was going on was more of these land battles between Vermont and New York. So we did a number of events, again, trying to get the word out. There's yours truly and a couple others at the Hoosick Falls History and Heritage Fair. So we've done tabling at some events. In the top right, you can see we were part of a trivia night, history trivia night contest at the Bennington Performing Arts Theater. We stood guard at the Haunted Covered Bridge event this past October. And in the bottom left, we even helped pitch some Ethan Allen gin for the Vermont distillery. We thought that, what if a bunch of us got into garb and went into just a random bar in Bennington and in other places. This is the first one, so this happens to be in Bennington. And just showed up and started loudly talking about what's going on 250 years ago. And so it'd be kind of not like a flash mob, but like sort of a history mob. I'm not even sure what you call it. But we're like, well, let's give this thing a try. And then let's see if we can maybe have a surprise ending to engage people. So let me see if this works for us.
I'm looking for the Catamount Carrot.
Oh, okay, hold on a sec. Let me try this again. You can hear it, but you can't see it. All right. So I'm gonna go. Oh, try it one more time. There's this funny twist where. All right, gonna try it one more time, folks. Thank you for bearing with me. So I'm gonna cut out of this. Let me jump here. You see that? All right. The irony was I could see it on my screen, didn't really. So here we go. I'm not gonna just play the whole thing. I'm just gonna play a couple of cuts from it.
That burned down years ago. What? Yeah, how could that be? I'll just have a nail.
Nail? I can do that.
Things have certainly changed. Substantially. Whoa. This Catamount Carrot, when did it burn down? Hundreds of years ago. Robinson? Bill? John Robinson? Hi, it's good to see you. What brings you back here to the Catamount? Well, Elijah Newry. Yes, I've been away.
So we talk about the arrests that are happening, about the Yorkers coming and stealing our land, and how we sent Green Mountain Boys to deal with them. But then, of course, because it's Bennington, Ethan Allen makes an appearance. And whenever Ethan Allen appears, he's larger than life. He kind of steals the show. So I'm going to jump right into after Ethan Allen has arrived at the pub, and we continue on our story. Let's see if we can get that.
20-pound bounty on our head scares us. I'm going to put a bounty on their head. They're only 15 pounds. They ain't worth as much. It is not just our right, but it is our duty to protect our family.
Indeed.
And the homes we cut out of the wilderness.
That's right. What nerve they have.
Any Yorker who dares lay claim to our lands will have to deal with the wrath of the Green Mountain Boys.
Absolutely. Huzzah! Huzzah!
Are they with you?
Is that intentional?
We see what they want.
How did it get in here?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Is there an Ethan Allen here?
Chief of Police.
Captain Ethan Allen at your service, sir. Mr. Allen, I have a warrant for your arrest. What? From New York. Oddly enough, it's 250 years old. But nonetheless, come with me. Place your hands behind your back. Hold on, Stan. Mark my words, I'll be rescued by a time I'm halfway to Albany.
idea.
So pretty fun. We did it again in Hoosick Falls. We're still trying to get a connection with the Manchester Police Department to do it in Manchester, so hoping to do that this spring. All right, so we're gonna jump back. Thank you for being with me.
Might add while you're scrolling, there are
Please.
some dubious looking characters in there. Martin Mahoney, the executive director of the museum, Tony Morrow and Jackie Morrow, you may know, Robert Ebert, the president of the Bennington Historical Society. Interesting collection of people on just a Saturday afternoon.
Purely random.
Up for a gig.
So thanks to Don for this next series. We talked about 1927 was an extraordinary year for monuments and memorials, and I'll go through these very quickly, and also partly I'm conscious of the time here. So keep in mind that doing a memorial is a big deal. You know, getting the stone, figuring out the wording, getting the bronze, everything made. So here's one, Peter Howard Homestead. He was one of the first settlers of Bennington. Here's a monument or a memorial for the first school in Bennington. I think it was placed by the DAR, is that correct? Daughters of the American Revolution?
Pardon?
Was it the Daughters of the American Revolution that placed that one, do you recall?
No, all the children of Bennington schools.
Oh, that's such a nice touch. Thank you for that, Don. Remember that meeting house photo I showed you, the aftermath of the battle? The building's no longer there, but they erected this very fine monument, and while this wasn't technically 1927, it was a few years before that, it's worth mentioning in this context. And then you can see in the top right, that's where in the 1960s, a couple of teenagers crashed into it, and it fell on top of them, didn't kill anyone, amazingly. And then in the bottom right is what its current configuration is. They reset it lying down.
Where is that?
That's right in front of the old First Church in Old Bennington. So, and nobody sees it. That's part of the problem. So one thought is maybe we could do something with that monument, re-erect it, do something to make it more visible, because it's kind of a shame, right? Lying flat like that, almost nobody knows it's there. Now these are all, again, back to these 1927 monuments. The Dimmock Tavern, this was one of the places where John Stark camped. Actually, Samuel Herrick, one of his captains, also lived right by there. There's the Breckenridge marker, birthplace of Vermont. It says so on bronze, so it must be correct. And just down the road, the Seth Warner homestead. Seth Warner, one of our greatest commanders, he lived right near the Battle of Bennington and knew the land well, which was to our advantage. And then again, just a little further down the road, there's John Stark's campground.
In Vermont.
In Vermont, but now we are crossing over into Vermont, and because they're all related to 1927, I'm going to mention these as well. This is the Colonel Baum marker. This is the house where he was mortally wounded and then died a couple days after the battle. And then there were 3 monuments at the battlefield in 1927 that were added. And on the one on the far right, that's a bas relief map of the battlefield. And actually, the plaster original cast of that is at the Bennington Museum. And then another monument at the second engagement spot, because the Battle of Bennington on the hill that everyone goes to is really just the first half of the story. The second half marker is this second engagement. So, and I'm going to skip by some of the things I was going to talk about on that, just in the interest of time. So obviously education is key. These are photographs from a deep dive we took into history with students at Mount Anthony. We want to broaden that. So we went to their curriculum department and had a pretty amazing meeting with their history teachers there on just ideas of how kids can get involved and get excited, how they can use the 250th as a lens for interpreting our local history and get them excited. And these are just some of the ideas they came up with. And but key to this is that, again, fully regional. They're engaging with schools all around the shires, including Burr and Burton. And just this past December, Katie Contrada and Brooke Remington presented at the 2023 Vermont Alliance of Social Studies conference in Burlington, talking about how the work they are doing to engage both their supervisory union, other teachers, other schools and classrooms in embracing this history. So I'm here, you're here, who else really needs to be here? Civic groups, the Lions, the Elks, the VFW, the American Legion. We want to engage all the towns and villages in the shires of Vermont. We want to engage our schools, as I said. We want to engage our colleges. And we want to engage our historical societies. And libraries, that ever-present bastion of democracy. We need them as well. What does this committee look like in the future? We need many hands on deck. We need many leaders. We want people that are excited about fundraising, marketing. Maybe you like event planning or helping out events. Maybe you're an author or a writer and you can help with publications. You're involved in education and more. Where do you see yourself? And how can your passion and expertise contribute to what we end up doing for the 250th? So with that, I wanted to kind of open it up to you a little bit. We're at about 12:53, so we're close to the end of time. But I consider all of you my peers and colleagues. You're all history buffs, and your ideas and thoughts are part of the reason I'm here today, to engage Dorset in this crazy endeavor that we're embarking on. So with that in mind, I leave it to your questions, and I did say part of the reason I came dressed in garb today is we're actively recruiting our own local reenactors to help tell this story. We already know, we talked about how valuable they are for engagement. So if you're interested in that side of it, or if you're interested in period firearms, or military history, or you like working with children or the public, there's lots of ways people can be involved. So thoughts or comments? Or good gossip to share.
Did you offer an email address to get in touch with you?
So Bennington250.org is the best way to get directly to this group, this committee, which does include, I'm happy to say, that John Mathewson and Sean Harrington are both members of our committee. And John is on our steering committee as well. So you could also reach out to any of those folks. And of course, I am the communications coordinator for Bennington. It's jspivak@benningtonvt.org, and I will give you my card after this presentation. But the easier thing perhaps to remember is just Bennington250.org. But remember, it's Bennington County, it's not just Bennington. So, please.
I think some of the ideas you presented are fabulous. To what extent is the rest of the state being pulled into these celebrations?
Yeah, so great question. The Vermont 250th Commission is active, and one thing that you can and should do right now is talk to your town leaders and say, hey, I know the state of Vermont 250th Committee sent you a resolution to support the 250th. And if your town has not already done so, encourage them to sign that. And basically what that does, that will plug your town or community into this larger Vermont 250th effort, so you'll be kept abreast of new things that are going on. You'll be able to tell us what your plans and ideas are, and we'll also be able to keep you updated on funding opportunities or other things that we could do to help market events. And actually that leads me to a thought that Don was mentioning right before the start of the program, which is at the local level, we are hoping to hear what are those tidbits of history that you think we should be highlighting as part of this effort. And just give us a little blurb about it. You can also send us your massive treatise on whatever it is that you want to talk about. But give us that little blurb and the date so we can get it on our radar screen early, so that we're doing a good job of making sure that all of these stories of these communities are being told together.
Are you getting the DAR involved in the SAR?
Absolutely. I've reached out to a number of folks, and I would add to that First Families of Vermont and the Descendants of the Green Mountain Boys. These are great organizations, incredibly proud and patriotic. Absolutely, yes, they have to be involved. We're working on a logo at the state level and locally, but at the state level, we're doing listening sessions, and I've suggested to them some members of the DAR and SAR to be part of that process. Yeah, great idea. DAR, short for Daughters of the American Revolution and Sons of the American Revolution, respectively. And I shouldn't use abbreviations. So.
You're fine.
Other thoughts or comments? Yes, please.
Well, in Paula, and we're part of Rutland County, although
Yep.
that's sort of artificial, isn't it, when you're talking about this period of history?
But you're pretty close to us.
Well, the Bennington well, there was this whole group under Benjamin Lincoln who came up through Manchester.
Paulet expedition,
Dorset,
absolutely.
Through Paulet, and the significance of that group seems to be more related to the Battle of Saratoga, the way I understand it, which also was 1777.
Yeah, I think it was in October of that year.
And Battle of
So-
Bennington was in August, is that right?
That's correct.
So this was, well, in fact, they came through Paulet in September, I believe. But somehow, all this whole group that was a combination of militias
Yeah.
from Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire, might have sent some, and some local people. So then they end up over participating in two battles,
That's
the Battle
right.
of Saratoga. So our quandary is whether, we don't want to have events for 8 years. I mean, the whole thing lasted 8 years. Really. So Paul is trying to decide, should we do our celebration coinciding with 1777? Because that's
Yeah.
250 years
Yeah.
from the Paulet expedition and Battle of Saratoga, also Battle of Bennington. So it's too hard for us to do something 3 years in a row. It's just,
In that case, I agree. Your part of the story shines with Benjamin Lincoln and the Paulet expedition, so I think that that would be an appropriate time. And also, you'd be able to benefit from all the buzz that will have been created over those 3 years. In a way, you're kind of the final part of the show, right? Yeah. Because it would be culminating that very important year of 1777, and the Paulet expedition and that your town's role really is that culmination. So that's a really good point. I think that if you're leaning towards 1 year to focus on, that does seem like the appropriate year.
okay.
Please.
You mentioned the first battle of Saratoga was in early September.
Oh, it
And
was.
then 3-4 weeks later, the second battle, which that's when Burgoyne retreated after the second battle, marched 10 miles north to what was then Saratoga, now Schuylerville, and he actually surrendered in Schuylerville. And they changed the name from Saratoga because people got confused with Saratoga Springs
Yeah.
and made it Schuylerville. So the Battle of Saratoga, which is celebrated with National Park, celebrates two battles that weren't in Saratoga. Right? They were in Stillwater. That's where Stillwater is. Now, there's a second phase of the Paulet. After Saratoga, people were going everywhere. They, you know, and some people didn't want to go certain places, but there was a remnant, a whole expedition called the Paulet Expedition. And what that was some of this Green Mountain Boys and friends going up to Paulet. Because of the way the mountains are structured, it proved to be a perfect place to watch for another invasion or re-invasion, because it'd have to come through a narrow gap and you could bottle them up or had a better chance.
Now, Don, let me pause you for 1 second. We are at time, so for people that might be missing this conversation that's happening within the audience, really great stuff, and I apologize that you're not hearing that. But at this point, I would suggest that we'll wrap up the presentation and let's please finish that point. That would be lovely. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so don't forget that. I mean, you've got the front part where people, after the Battle of Bennington, went over to Saratoga. And then after that all happened, a separate group came up to defend, and that was called the Paulet Expedition. So I think those two could be done together.
Yeah. Well said. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you all.